everyone. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to Matan's One-on-One podcast. If you would like to sponsor a podcast episode in honor or in memory of a loved one, please contact the Matan office via telephone or email us at podcast@matan.org.il. Each week, we spend 30 minutes speaking about a seminal figure or idea on that week's Parsha. Parshat Metzora speaks about the process of purification from Tzara'at, a skin disease, Tzara'at of the home, and a discussion of general bodily impurities. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Elana Stein Hain to speak about the Rambam's understanding of Tzara'at. Elana is a director of faculty and a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, and she co-hosts For Heaven's Sake, a bi-weekly podcast with Danielle Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi. She also has an online series called Talmud from the Balcony, trying to extrapolate big philosophical ideas from the Talmud. Elana, it's a pleasure to be sitting here with you.
What a joy. And isn't it nice that technology makes this possible?
Totally. Many years ago, I was a young student in Stern, and Elana was this just booming, luminous figure in the Beit Midrash. So it's great to sort of come full circle so many years later and be speaking to you here.
It's my honor. And what better challenge than to talk about Tzara'at?
Exactly.
Which really is quite unique on the skyline of halacha, of tum'ah and tahara.
So let's jump right in. How do we want to tackle this topic of Tzara'at, which of course takes up quite a number of verses in Sefer Vayikra. It's pretty looming as well. I think that in the years also where we have a second Adar, we have the opportunity to talk about Tzara'at for 2 weeks in a row, and not only one.
It's like, slow it down, everybody.
Exactly.
Don't rush through Tzara'at.
We can't rush through it. We can't get away from it. We can't just focus on the birthing woman. We have to really get into the details of Tzara'at. So that's why we're sitting down today, to really go deep into the topic itself and to try and unravel some of the ideas that are hidden or somehow really imprinted in this particular situation.
Oh, sure. So I'm intrigued by the way that the Rambam reads Tzara'at as a phenomenon, because he goes beyond what we usually think of as you spoke Lashon Hara, you spoke bad about someone, you get Tzara'at, you go out of the camp because you did something antisocial, so now you're going to be alone. That's often the way that we hear about it. And of course, echoes of Miriam speaking Lashon Hara about Moshe. But the Rambam actually builds a much more complex edifice around this. And I would say he starts with the premise that Tzara'at is not natural. It's miraculous, okay? And it's interesting also from the point of view of somebody who was a doctor, who was a medical professional himself, to say this is not a natural thing. And I say this as somebody who works at the Hartman Institute, which in Jerusalem is across from Beit Hansen, which Hansen was a leper colony. Back in the day, I found out while I was there one summer. But he does something more. Now that it's miraculous, he can make it philosophical. So the first thing he does, as I think a contribution, is he says, know that there is actually a process of Tzara'at from your external to your body. So despite the fact that the Torah lists Tzara'at of the home last, for the Rambam, a person, here's how the process would go. If you tell Lashon Hara, your house is going to get Tzara'at. And if you decide to do tshuva, it'll stop. If you don't, it'll move to your furniture. If you decide to do tshuva, it'll stop. If you don't, it'll move to your clothing. If you decide to do tshuva, if not, it'll go to your person, right? So the first thing is he says there's like a warning system about it. He wants to connect the different types of Tzara'at as it's like concentric circles. The warning is getting closer and closer and closer.
I really also want to point out for our listeners how unusual this interpretation is, meaning it's not your natural read when you're reading the Psukim. You do wonder, and Chazal speak about this in many places, you do wonder what the connection is between all the different kinds of Tzara'at. And I believe the root of the Rambam's approach here is in Chazal, that they offer a number of models. But when you first read it in the Rambam, there's something very striking about it. And you wonder, what is the process? What is the dialogue between the body and the home? But also what's interesting, Elana, is that in a previous episode when I was speaking with Yael Leibowitz, so we actually said something that really went against this interpretation, both by the Rambam and by Chazal, because we spoke about Tzara'at as being part of this group of impurities that are just ritual impurities. They happen. They're part of life, right? You go through life, women become nida. You go through life, bodies have all different kinds of emissions. And because at your first read, a lot of the laws surrounding Tzara'at, the psukim themselves in our Parshat, they do not connect between a spiritual punishment of some sort or some sort of dialogue with God and Tzara'at, meaning it doesn't show up here. It shows up, as you mentioned, in that by Miriam when she speaks ill of her brother, and she's very clearly punished with Tzara'at. It's hard to read that story and not look at it as a punishment. And Chazal really broaden that and say that all of Tzara'at comes as a result of some sort of ill speech. But what I want to point out is in our Parshat, that connection isn't actually created yet.
Look, I could say something even more general than that, which is the shoresh, the word tameh or tum'ah in Torah and in Tanakh. Sometimes it's used to denote ritual impurity, and sometimes it's used to denote sin. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think there's a slippery question to begin with that we could ask about what is the relationship between the idea of ritual purity and the idea of sin, right? Which I'd imagine that you and Yael got into, but I'm just noting Tzara'at may actually be a really great example of the Venn diagram and the overlap where you're sort of like, but the psukim don't say that it's about anything that you did wrong. And then you have this example of Miriam, right? Or looking at Moshe and his various muftim that he was able to, that he took his hand out and it was Metzora, and then he put it back in and it was no longer.
Right. It's also this miraculous sign, and it might also be I agree with you. To look at it as just purely dichotomous is a very academic exercise.
Well, it might be pointing us exactly to the impossibility of taking these apart. But that's what brings me actually to the next piece in the Rambam, because the Rambam, by looking at Miriam's sin, right, he points out that even in Devarim, right, Devarim talks about, you should be careful, right? You should keep an eye out for nega tzara'at, right? Hishamer b'nega tzara'at. And Zachor asher asa Hashem Elokecha leMiriam b'derech. Remember what God did to Miriam. And so the Rambam says, I actually think that what Miriam did in talking about Moshe may be indicative of what Tzara'at is about. Not just Lashon Hara, but actually something worse, Lashon Hara as a gateway to something worse. And so just like he built his, steps of you go from the house to the furniture, to the clothing, to the person, he's going to build steps here too. He thinks that Lashon Hara is a gateway, because if you're telling Lashon Hara, you're sitting around with people who talk like that, who are scoffers, who look at what's happening in the world and they say, I'm going to poke a hole in it. And the next thing, after you talk about what he would say is Gnut HaTzadikim, saying bad about people who are good, you're going to end up talking about the Daber B'Nevi'im. You're going to talk about the Nevi'im and say, you know what? I'm not so sure. Now, this is not exactly what Miriam did, but I'm not so sure that everything they're saying is true. And then to him, the final step is, Umitoch kach, based on this, ba'in ledaber be'elokim v'kofrin ba'ikar. You're going to end up bad-mouthing God and denying God's essence. Okay, now we'll talk about what that means, denying the essence, but I think that is a fascinating move. And I think it's because he has Miriam there, who was talking not just Lashon Hara about anybody, but was talking about a Navi. Now look at it as, you're not going out of the camp because you said something antisocial. You're going out of camp because we're trying to get you away from whoever you were hanging out with, who is pushing you in the direction of being a scoffer, because this could have incredibly negative effects on your religious life at some point, right? And I think that is actually an amazing move. I think it's an amazing move for a few reasons. I want to start with the fact that kofrin be'ikar means something in the Rambam. What it means in the Rambam is someone who denies divine providence. And all you have to just look in the third book of the Moreh Nevuchim, right? I think he starts around section 16, and he goes through for several chapters talking about this. What he really thinks is the heart of what Tzara'at is trying to get us away from, is denying that God is watching over the world. And guess what? What better way to undercut a person's denial of God watching over the world than when they speak Lashon Hara, immediately they experience Tzara'at. God was clearly watching. And then if they stop speaking Lashon Hara, the Tzara'at goes away. If they start speaking it, it comes back. There's an immediate gratification. There's an immediate providence that's in it, which the Rambam really teases out in saying.
It's also, if you go back to the gradation of how he presented it before, of the house to the objects to the body, you also see an element here of, well, somebody doubts God's providence, so let's get him punished. His realm will be punished, his outer trappings, and then slowly, if he doesn't get convinced that there is significance to how he behaves or the way he, the attitude he has towards the world and towards God, so slowly it creeps up on him. Meaning, there's a providence, but there's something also something gentle, right? There's something that is almost it gives him chance until you get to a point where you say, "Oh my God!" But it's literally attacking my body and I have no choice, right? But it's sort of, God lets his providence or his interaction with the world sort of creep up slowly on this individual, until he then gets to a point where there's no other option other than to believe, apparently, that God is actually directly involved in the world.
That idea of the gradations, isn't it parallel to what the Rambam is saying your surroundings do to you, right? The Rambam is saying if you are surrounded by people, right, who are talking in a certain way, you're not going to become a denier of God's providence immediately. That's not the way it's going to happen. They're going to make you kind of cynical about everything. You're going to get cynical about the good people around you. You're going to get cynical about the Navi. You're going to get cynical about God. I think there is a paralleling of, the Rambam's trying to make this into something that's about human nature and the way that human beings learn and the way things seep in, right? So I think that's part of it. What's kind of remarkable is, when you look in the way, this is all, like you can find the Rambam writing lines and lines, right, at the end of any section of halacha in the Mishnah Torah, right? You'll always find the Rambam say something philosophical about what it is that he just taught you laws about. So this approach to Tzara'at, he does this at the end of Hilchot Tumat Tzara'at, right? The laws of the impurity of this skin disease. So it's Perek Tet Zayin, Halacha Yud. And it's long. But what's fascinating is when he comes to describe, from all this, a person could get to a slippery slope of being kofer ba'ikar. Listen to the pasuk that he quotes, okay? He quotes a pasuk from Malachim Bet, okay? Chapter 17, verse 9, Yud Zayin Tet. Vayichap'u b'nei Yisrael dvarim asher lo chen al Hashem Elokehem. The Jewish people imputed to God things that God didn't do, right? Told Lashon Hara about God. It's sort of like, I'm not sure that most people, when they're reading the Rambam, they're saying to themselves like, oh, is this such a familiar pasuk? I'm not sure if this is such a familiar pasuk. Then you look in Moreh Nevuchim, okay? Book 3, section Yutet, or Perek Yutet, and what is the pasuk that he's using to talk about divine providence and people who don't believe in it? He says, "Vayichap'u b'nei Yisrael dvarim asher lo kein al Hashem." That the Jewish people imputed things that are not true about God, and he says, and the Midrash tells us, Ma amru, what did they say? Amru, they said, Ha'amud hazeh eino ro'eh ve'eino shomea ve'eino medaber. God is just this pillar who doesn't see and doesn't hear and doesn't know what's going on. It's literally, if you hyperlink, right?
Yeah.
You hyperlink.
Yeah, there's a web connection
here. Says in Mishnah Torah, because he doesn't say in Mishnah Torah what it means really to be kofir ba'ikar, right? He just says kofrin ba'ikar. But then by quoting that pasuk, he's telling you, go look, right? In my other book, and in my other book, what I have is, what this means is you don't believe in providence. And so if a person is really saying, I don't believe in providence, here comes Tzara'at to say, well, believe it because it's here. And I think what's so troubling, I think, about Tzara'at for us nowadays is like, we don't always feel that. We don't always experience that. In fact, it's very infrequent that we experience that kind of sense of, oh, well, God is here and God is watching and I know and I this and I that. And there's something that Tzara'at is actually trying to remind us of that, and what I hope is that even if we don't see that all the time, that first of all, when we do get glimpses of it, we are willing to see those glimpses for what they are, right? And not say, oh, well, maybe I'm crazy. I don't know, right? But actually to say, like, as a believing person, there's actually something that I see that's providential here and appreciating. And at the same time, that it should actually give us some sense of chizuk during a time like this, like war breaking out, 2 years of pandemic, to say, like, there's somebody who's actually watching, right? That God is really watching. And so this year, to me, it's more of like a chizuk builder than anything else.
It's interesting because in a much earlier episode, when I was speaking with Tanya White about general issues of suffering, we spent a whole episode speaking about the Rambam's approach to illness. And there he was not speaking about Tzara'at, and that's the biggest difference between this conversation and anything to talk about the Rambam's approach to illness, because he's a very naturalistic perspective on illness. And he says you have to be extremely careful about not attributing a lot of illness to God. People get very angry at God, or they assume that God sent the illness, but you have to sort of eliminate first all these natural factors in the world of that we're humans and our bodies decay, and that, in comparison to the broader species, very few people are actually born with different deformities, and he sort of like eliminates so many categories of things so that you only attribute to God a very, very small portion of of illness or physical disease that can afflict the body. However, and I understand why, he looks at Tzara'at in a completely different light than how he expressed it there. Now, it's also, there might be a difference here also between the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, and here in his Mishnah Torah. And there's so much to be said about the differences between those works. And in the Moreh Nevuchim, he's always going to present a bit more of a nuanced approach than he will in his general halachic work. But I think that the biggest difference is simply because this is about Tzara'at, and the Torah itself presents Tzara'at, as you said, it's this Venn diagram, sort of mixed space between something that is both physical, but it's spiritual, and it's occupying different realms. And so I think that within the world of the Rambam, it's an interesting case study to compare it to his general approach to illness. And don't be so quick to be angry at God for everything that goes wrong in the world. Where here he's saying, be super careful to attribute it to God, right? Be super careful to make sure that you don't miss the message.
Right. And I think that's why he starts with, like, some of the first words of that halakha is the Rambam saying, make sure you know that this is not a natural illness.
Yeah.
Because if it was a natural illness, he wouldn't attribute it to punishment in that same way.
Totally.
It's because it's, as he calls it, miraculous that he can.
Elana, it really connects for me to, general beliefs that I hold, along with many others, about the body in general. Meaning, in the Torah, it's an explicitly spiritual connection, meaning it's because of sin or because you're perhaps denial of God's providence in the world. But I think that Tzara'at, even without going as far as the spiritual punishment, is also this phenomenal reminder that the things that afflict our body are meant to teach us something. Meaning, sometimes they're meant to teach us about our relationship with our body. Sometimes they're meant to teach us about ways that we're living that aren't healthy for us. Again, whether they're specific spiritual problems or or otherwise. Spirit is such a broad phrase. It's not just about only, sins that are written in Mishnah Torah. There's all different ways that we sin against our body, even if it's not written in the Mishnah Torah. And so I think that for me also, when I read about Tzara'at, it sort of reminds me very much. And as you said, for me, it strengthens a bit of that worldview of remembering that illness is often here to show us something, to teach us something about the way we live our life, about the way we treat our body, and in this particular case, perhaps, but also the way that we think of God.
Well, it's making me think about the way that the Rambam talks in Shmona Prakim, right? In his essay that's connected to Pirkei Avot, where he really describes the process of becoming spiritually ill and then spiritually healed by expert doctors, so to speak, as comparable to the process of becoming physically ill and being healed by expert doctors, most literally. And I think there is a parallel to be drawn here of the kind of gradational slope that a person goes down, right? Again, it's strange because it's not presented that way in the Chumash itself. And as you said, of course, there are roots to this in Chazal, but it is a surprising way to go. It actually almost feels like the Rambam is using a metaphor from medicine in talking about how the illness of Tzara'at moves from your house to your clothes to your body, right? It almost sounds like it comes from medicine.
Totally.
And it's being pulled that way, the way he does in Shmona Prakim.
It's also fascinating to think about how much of that obviously is drawn from his life experience as a physician, right? Meaning it's obviously these people say, oh, he was also a doctor, he was also a rabbi. I hope that those were two fields obviously that enriched each other. And what we're seeing here also, he's saying that he's drawing from that world of his, that's what he was doing every day.
Right. Well, there's another layer that I want to add here, because when the Rambam talks in Mor Nevuchim about people, not believing in divine providence, the focus really is this question of why are bad people flourishing and good people are suffering. And I think that's where you might actually really have to see a tension between the doctor experience and the rabbi or spiritual leader experience. Because the doctor's responsibility is to heal you, whether you're good or you're bad. And the spiritual leaders is doing something else, right? Like they're actually, it's a different kind of measure. And as a doctor, when you can't heal someone, especially if you know they're good, but you can't heal them, despite all the science that you're using, that leads you to sort of like well, what do I do with this? Is this still in the realm of medicine? Is this in the realm of something else? And that's kind of what you were saying about the Rambam earlier about illness, that the Rambam does not go the direction, and if I can't heal you, it means there's something religiously wrong with you. He doesn't go in that direction, even if it's tempting. But for our purposes of Tzara'at, what I think is also so rich about the fact that good tzaddik viralo, good people having bad things happen to them, and Rasha v'tovlo, bad people having good things happen to them, is that this actually all comes at the beginning, even at the Lashon Hara stage. It comes from trying to discern who's good and who's bad, right? You told Lashon Hara about somebody because people think they're good, but I'm going to tell you that they're bad, right? And now the way you end up is people might have thought you were good, and here you are sitting with your Tzara'at, and everyone says, that person is that. So this whole discernment of good and bad actually does connect from the very mundane, typical Lashon Hara to the very intense, theologically charged question of divine providence.
When we speak about this, I'm sort of breathing in heavily because people struggle with it on a daily basis. Meaning these are struggles that don't just remain theoretical or academic for people. And I think that on an ideological level, these are ideas that are incredibly important for us to think about. But I think that for many people, it hits them in a very practical place. Okay, meaning these ideas of I'm going through life and I think I'm doing my best, but I'm met with a lot of really, really hard stuff or illness or whatever the example is. I feel like the Rambam's take on this disease is one that it's incredibly powerful because it cuts to the core of things and it makes all of it sort of a measure for measure system. It's also not so simple to digest, I think, as I'm, listening to our conversation unravel.
Let's just say, I think it would be dangerous for the Rambam to extrapolate from Tzara'at to other experiences of disease. Mm-hmm. I think it would be theologically dangerous because then you're making an argument that disease is punishment. And the Rambam is trying so hard not to say that. This is miraculous. It's in its own. And in fact, we don't have it today. Like, there's something you're making me realize that on the one hand, it's trying to give us chizuk to basically say, no, God is really watching. And if somebody does something bad, God will actually respond, da-da-da. But on the other hand, the Rambam does not want us looking at this. And I do not want us looking at this as, oh, well, this explains disease in general. Quite the opposite, right? We live in a world, I think, where depending on where you see divine providence and the causes that you give to it, you could be doing something very theologically harmful to people, or it could be doing something very theologically beneficial to people. Like the difference between trying to ask why somebody got a certain disease on the one hand and saying, you know what, God sees how you're dealing with your hardship and you have so much to be proud of in the way that you're dealing with this. Those are both providential models, but very, very different. And the latter is the only one I'd feel comfortable with.
Right. It's the response model as opposed to looking at the causality. I think that that's something that we also, I'm gonna link the episode in general at the bottom of the show notes, our episode regarding disease and the Rambam's perspective on it. But I think that that's a really, really essential point that's always really necessary to emphasize. So we're speaking here, and I think also, Elana, that there may be a blessing in the fact that we don't have Tzara'at anymore, so that we can talk about this. No, not only so that we won't be
in theory,
right? We could talk about it in theory. I really think that there's a blessing to that. But by the way, what I do really love, and maybe we're coming to the end of our conversation, but I love the concept of Tzara'at touching the house. Because I love the idea that the spaces we occupy have soul in them. I don't mean it in the, Japanese tidying, I have to thank all of my objects for serving me in that sort of realm. But I'll say it in a story that I once heard. I think it was the name of Rav Dov Zinger, where he said that when he goes to sleep at night, or when he would go to sleep at night and his children were younger, he said he would daven to the walls of his house. Because he wanted to surround them, whatever trouble they were going through or difficulties or just general, teenage rebellions, that he wanted the home to be supportive of them. And that even if they wouldn't listen, or if it was hard to say it to them, to their face, that he wanted them to be surrounded by it. And it's something that my husband and I think about a lot. We think about, the conversations we have about our kids when they're not awake, which can vary to all different degrees. But
of course.
Whenever we have a conversation that's difficult, I'm like tearing up right now. Whenever we have a conversation that's difficult, I always end it with a tefillah.
Yeah.
And I always say to them, it's for the walls. It's for the walls.
Well, it's so, yeah. So.
No, I'm with you. And it just, Tzara'at HaBayit is just this reminder that our spaces are influenced by us, and our spaces that we're in influence us, whether that's our physical house or it's the people we surround ourselves with. But all of that has impact, and we could choose very often whether it's positive or negative.
What you're really pushing me to is that Tzara'at is pushing against seeing the individual as the receptacle for good or bad behavior, and instead is pushing to see a person's whole environment as a shaper of their behavior, whether it's, as the Rambam is saying, who are you spending time with, who's impacting the way you think, that's about your whole social circle, or whether it's about the confines of your actual house, that's another piece here. That it's not just what did you do, it's what are you a part of? And are you impacting the places that you're a part of in a good way? And are they impacting you in a good way? that I think you really just teased out for us in a beautiful way.
Yeah, it's a message that I speak about a lot with younger students. And I don't think its relevance ever really ends. I mean, whenever we try and figure out, a community to be a part of, or, a kehillah, whatever part of the world we're doing that in, it's basically the same question all the time. What college to put ourselves in, or who we want to spend time with. They all really surround the same question. And it's a question that comes up here in the Rambam surrounding Tzara'at, but it's a question that constantly follows us because we're always really aware in some deep place of the fact that we impact our environment and our environment impacts us. And I think that's a beautiful way to end the episode. That Tzara'at is there to remind us of this sort of like village that we're always part of. And of course, in the Rambam's mind, to remember that God is always watching. And while maybe this is not a method of communication that still exists in the world, of course, there are still many others.
Well, it's nice to be part of this village. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Matan's website. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in the comments. Please send us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.